Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, you know, during these History Hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great research being done by folks who have used the historical collections in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support from the Hagley Center in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds. One such scholar joining me today is Clark Barwick, teaching professor of business communication at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. Clark, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Let's by painting with broad strokes. What is it you're researching and writing about?
So I came to Hagley interested in a chemist from the last century named Peter Schlumbohm, who invented a device called the Chemex Coffeemaker that has sustained in popularity since the 40s.
And what is your interest in this subject?
So my research interest broadly is in food studies. I'm interested in the global coffee trade.
Mm.
And in teaching classes and reading a lot about coffee and thinking about coffee, I came to learn about Peter Schlumbohm, who grew up in Germany, trained as a PhD in chemistry, a serial inventor, just a super fascinating guy who immigrated to New York in the 30s and invented this device, which in my research I think I can say with confidence that it's one of the first significant American contributions to global coffee culture,
Mm.
and that was just really exciting. And so in my research, I discovered that Hagley owned some of the most important documents that exist relevant to Peter Schlumbohm and his career. And so I was able to connect with you all and visit the archive last summer.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, industrial design is one of our special collecting areas of interest. What is it that you discovered in the archive in the Schlumbohm papers?
So Peter Schlumbohm was a very interesting guy. He was a serial inventor. He wasn't by trade in the coffee industry. He just created this invention to solve a problem. He was sort of unhappy with the thickness and sort of murkiness of coffee, and so he creates this chemistry device that sort of endures. But he was also a master entrepreneur. I think for our listeners and our viewers, you might imagine someone operating in New York during the Mad Men era, maybe a little bit before that. But he was, in addition to being a brilliant chemist and inventor, he was also a very smart business person, and really marketed the Chemex and his other inventions, which we can talk about if you'd like, in a way that got his products in front of people. And Hagley happened to, by way of another collector, come into some of his scrapbooks that he kept. So, in addition to being just a really innovative person, he also was keeping business records, keeping all sorts of publication and advertising materials, and just overall just information about his business. And that was a lot of what is stored at Hagley. So when I came to Hagley, there were most of the information on Schlumbohm is it seems like these are scrapbooks. It appears that he produced scrapbooks himself, but it might have been somebody in his company. And these scrapbooks are just really fascinating to look at. They have personal photographs, they have business documents, they have blueprints and prototypes for the Chemex. So if you're trying, like me as a cultural historian, trying to put together a story, he's really left us a lot. And then there are also things that I left Hagley with more questions, which is also really fun.
Mm-hmm. Well, what is it about the Chemex that makes it so special?
So prior to the Chemex, most coffee, like I said earlier, was made in what we would probably call these days the coffee itself was kind of disgusting. It was thick. There wasn't a consistent process for sort of making coffee. Percolators, other devices, heavy machinery produced coffee. It was often burnt, overcooked. And Schlumbohm decided, as a chemist, and he had been very interested in refrigeration. He had done work for the American Thermos Company. So he was already thinking in terms of food, storage. He created devices and inventions for like cigarettes, automatic trash cans. He was already thinking about how to improve daily life in terms of consumption. So he basically creates this device, and I'll actually show it for those of you who are watching the video of this, and I'll try to describe this for those of you who are just listening. He creates this device that looks like it could appear in a lab. It's essentially a glass carafe or a sort of an hourglass device. There's no electricity. It essentially, I guess you would just call it a flask, and it has a wooden sleeve on it, so when the device gets really, really hot because it's brewing coffee, it will, somebody could actually pick it up and pour it or use it. But the idea is that you've basically got this hourglass flask, makes 30-ish ounces of coffee. You put a double bonded filter on top and put coffee, ground coffee in the filter, and pour hot water over it. So it's a pretty all-in-one device. It was nice for during the wartime, because this device was essentially developed in the late 30s and comes to market in the 40s, when materials were scarce, and so metal and other devices that would have been needed in a war effort. Schlumbohm, who by the way was German and had served in the German army in World War I, and came to America and became a proud American by the time of World War II. He develops this device that essentially now, if you ever consume coffee via a pour over, which is often a 1 cup type of device, this is a forerunner to that. So what happens is when you put the coffee in and you have a filter over this glass device, over this conical flask, from a sort of a chemistry perspective, it's producing a super clean cup of coffee that would retain the caffeine, but it would pull out a lot of the oils. So in a lot of ways, a very different type of coffee than if you're familiar with how espresso is made, which actually pulls out all the delicious oils and retains a lot of the flavors. This is going to produce a cup of coffee that is really clean and light and delicious. And so the device itself, which is beautiful and was Bauhaus inflected, it actually has been, Schlumbohm was friends with the Bauhaus community, and this device has actually been on display at MoMA and other museums around, and permanent collections around the world. So it's appreciated as this beautiful aesthetic thing, but it actually makes a cup of coffee that those who are interested in specialty coffee today still, like if you talk to someone who is really interested in coffee, they'll still know what a Chemex is, and many people still use them. My wife and I were just watching like a home and garden, like an HGTV show the other day, 2 consecutive episodes, a family that was showing off their cabin or whatever, like they were different families were brewing a Chemex. And so it's a lifestyle, it's an aesthetic device, but really at the end of the day, it produces really, really clean, delicious coffee.
Which is something pretty remarkable out of such an elegant device, such a simplistic device. Is that
That's
perhaps part of its magic?
I think that's part of its magic. I think it's the whole thing that it's an experience. Prior to the time that Schlumbohm creates this Chemex, coffee, and still for a lot of people, coffee is a very functional thing. You drink coffee to get your day started. You don't really worry in the way that you might think about wine or other types of food, the quality of your coffee. Some of us do, but a lot of us drink coffee functionally. That was certainly going on in the 20s leading up to the time of this device. And then during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when we really see mass production of food items in the United States with the canister of Folgers that a lot of our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents may have consumed, this device really facilitates the experience of coffee, which gets picked up later in the 60s, the 70s, 80s, eventually with Starbucks and what's called the second wave of coffee, that really starts to think of coffee as a more special food item rather than just this thing, coffee in big letters that you would drink a mug of and then just go to work. And then more recently, the third wave, which has been over the last 20 years, where we really have especially coffee enthusiasts and companies doing all sorts of innovative things. Schlumbohm's really at the beginning of this, and I love the fact that um, that he created this device in America, but he was an immigrant. And I think that's you're asking me about what attracts me to his story. I think in this era, as when we look back at what's made America what it is and what can make America in the future, I
Mhm.
think that Schonbaum's an excellent example of someone bringing ideas and education from another culture and doing something wildly imaginative in the United States that benefits the world. That's really exciting to me.
Yeah, that is a great story. I'm wondering how he marketed this device. You said that he was really successful in getting his products in front of people, building perhaps a awareness in the marketplace of his products. How was he able to market the Chemex?
He really had a good mind for product placement, and he understood things like pricing. He understood department store culture. He understood that this device was important to get in front of women as well as men, because women were at the time and still and across America, really prominent in terms of thinking about a family's food consumption and buying patterns. So he was reaching out to Macy's. He was getting his device and catalogs, obviously way pre-internet. So if someone in Nebraska if he wanted to connect with a person there, he was figuring out the correct catalogs. He was thinking a lot about what the perfect price point was, and then he was doing a lot in terms of sort of, I guess we would call them trade shows. Uh, he's living in Midtown Manhattan, so he has a lot of friends that are in. This is kind of the height of. Or one of the peaks of American magazine readership, and
Hmm.
so he's featured in Life. He's featured in the New Yorker. I mean, absolutely, it's almost hard to explain how many people would have encountered Schlumbohm through Life magazine at the time, being featured in the 1940s. So he's really good about all that. And then I'm trying to figure out where Schlumbohm was a dynamic person, and so where he was being featured because someone thought the work he was doing was really interesting, and where he was able to kind of negotiate his way into publications. I think it was a little bit of both. But for instance, James Bond in From Russia with Love, in the novel, Ian Fleming's novel, James Bond drinks a Chemex. And so I'm almost certain Schlumbohm wasn't contacting Ian Fleming and saying, "Hey, could you put my device in your book?" So I think that he was good at letting people know about his device, and then once they discovered it and found that it's this thing that's endured for 80 some odd years, enthusiastically it shows up in Friends, for instance, in their apartment in the popular 90s show. So it's just something that kind of took on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I my in-laws, when they got really into coffee culture, they had to get a Chemex and were preaching, proselytizing about its virtues. I'm wondering, you said that this was one of the first real American contributions to global coffee culture. What is the American position in that global culture, and have we contributed in other meaningful ways to it?
I think so. And coffee is so I teach classes on the global coffee trade at Indiana University. And coffee is impossible to talk about without talking about globalism and exchange and innovation, because a lot of the viewers and listeners may not realize this, but coffee can't be grown, at least now. Maybe with climate change will change, that will change, but coffee cannot be grown in the United States outside of Hawaii. So coffee has to be grown in an equatorial belt, but coffee is consumed all over the world. And most cultures have now a connection to coffee. So whether we're talking about the cherry that's being pulled off the plant all the way to being roasted and packaged and ending up in your Starbucks drive-through. Coffee is inextricably connected to all sorts of issues having to do with equity, human rights, but just globalism in general. So if we look at American contributions from that perspective, there's always exchange going on. It's difficult to pull anything uniquely out. But I would say, for instance, in the last 30 or 40 years, the prevalence of a company like Starbucks and lots of other companies. But now, for instance, in Asia, Korea historically was a tea drinking country, and within a decade, and largely due, I would argue, to the prominence of companies like Starbucks, coffee is wildly popular in that country. And I would
Hmm.
say that's one way to think about contribution. There are a lot of, on a micro level, a lot of other exchanges that have happened. Americans purchase a lot of coffee too. So when the system's sort of working, in my opinion, the right way, we're investing in purchasing coffee as conscious, active consumers, and buying from the right places. And Americans have that purchasing power. So I would say that in a lot of ways, we're dictating the lives of people far outside the United States. So that's kind of an expansive answer, but I would say that America sort of picked up with Schlumbohm, and now every single city in the United States has its own specialty coffee culture.
It's pretty remarkable to think that America is importing this coffee and then exporting a business model built around it in the form of Starbucks or other chains that then create new coffee drinkers elsewhere. That's a really, really remarkable and highly globalized story, isn't it?
That's right, and it brings with it, as I talk with my students in nearly every class, it brings enormous responsibility. And so one of the things that's been really exciting about teaching on coffee and food in general, but especially coffee, is that we have this special power that we have to understand when we go and buy something in the store, or we frequent a certain type of establishment in terms of our coffee, or when we go somewhere else, when we travel abroad and we decide to try something new. We're doing more than just creating an experience for ourselves. And at least within coffee, because I've studied enough to say that we have a profound impact on communities around the globe that we might not even realize, that we're impacting. So there is a responsibility there, and that can be something we look at productively. I don't think it has to be just about being critical of ourselves. Like, I think we can actually, there's actually space for change if we're engaged.
Hmm. Now, you mentioned different waves of coffee culture in the United States. Could you perhaps briefly sketch that narrative history for us?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, in the 50s, so the time when Schlumbohm was kind of zagging, where everybody is sort of zigging in a certain, we're very familiar with mass consumption, mass production of all sorts of items, but food becomes mass produced, and coffee in particular, like I was saying, like with the big canisters of coffee. So during the 50s and 60s, every house starts to, coffee would be some place that you could get a diner or a restaurant, but it really becomes ubiquitous in American households. So houses would have a coffee, a way to make coffee, if not the kind of classic coffee maker, which today you almost really see in hotels. Like, a lot of people have moved on to different coffee devices rather than the classic coffee pot. But those classic coffee pots allowed families to scoop 10 scoops of coffee that was, who knows what quality it was, who knows where it was made. It was coffee. But everyone, it was very affordable. It was consistent, even if it might not have tasted awesome. And that's the first wave of ubiquitous coffee in the United States. The second wave, again, comes up with companies like Starbucks. Starbucks wasn't the first, but companies like Starbucks that start to say, hey, this product that all of us are drinking, and it's it's an industry of billions of dollars. Like, let's time out. Maybe we can like make this taste better. And it's not actually that difficult to make it taste better if you just focus on the actual product itself, how we brew it. And we'll give Americans and people around the world, but think about Starbucks and the vocabulary that, if you're my age, We didn't grow up using grande, venti, macchiato, these terms that Starbucks has actually even in some ways created themselves. In some instances, what a macchiato means to people in America is different than what the actual classic coffee term is. But the fact that your grandmother or someone who was not a foodie or a food person would then be able to use coffee vocabulary, that's what we see happening in the late 80s and 90s.
Hmm.
In the more recent decades, there was a focus on specialty coffee and really understanding coffee almost on the level that like wine enthusiasts would have, for just trying to produce the perfect cup of coffee, and in a local fashion. So you could get that in most towns. What I think the problem with that, and that would have been called the third wave, or is called the third wave, there was a certain elitism to that I think has been documented about. I mean, you can just imagine the sort of stereotypes that you go into a coffee shop and you don't know anything about coffee and you just want a cup of coffee, or you want to maybe even try something new, and you look at a menu and there are all these, and you go up and you know these terms and these drinks, and you go up and you ask the barista, and they kind of, maybe hipster is the stereotype or whatever. You kind of feel stupid for even asking or even being in the store. This fourth wave or late third wave, which I would say has happened, it started before the pandemic, but more recently has said, okay, let's keep everything that's great about local specialty coffee. And this is Starbucks tells me that they're selling more cold coffee now than even hot coffee.
Hmm.
So it's not just your classic hot coffee, it's cold coffee, cold brew as well. But let's make this accessible. Like, let's not make people feel stupid. Let's open this up and actually go back to what Schlumbohm was thinking about, just a good experience. And so more recently, these I think a lot of coffee shops have really focused on being more welcoming, more of places for education. So if you go in and you just ask for your cup of coffee, you'll get it. But if you actually ask, one of the things I ask my students to think about is sourcing, because that's a big deal if you're thinking about human rights or price equity or whatever. And so you can go into your local coffee shop and say, where is this coffee from? And they say Guatemala, or they say Yemen, or wherever, and they might say Hawaii. And that tells you something, and they're glad to share that with you, but they don't make you feel stupid for asking. So
In a lot of ways, that story seems to mirror the trends in American consumer economy more broadly.
I hope so, right? And so hopefully we're doing a better job at understanding where our products come from, value and quality. I think that's something I see when I get, advertisement. I come across advertisements that are tailored for me on the internet, or I get something in the regular postal mail. There seems to be more attention paid. People are willing to pay more for quality items, and it's the same thing with coffee, that you're paying for what you get. And so there are a lot of people that can't afford a $9 coffee, and that's understandable, but can we bring the quality to a better price point? I think that's what's going on in a lot of shops, making the product more accessible. It's really exciting. But from teaching my students, it's always exciting when we start out a semester, and I'm able to go back to the place where I was when I first started studying food and coffee, and realize how little the average person actually knows about anything. Like, even where basic commodities that we consume all the time come from, we're very detached from the origins a lot of times. Not everyone. I have plenty of students that are from farms and places like that, but for a lot of students that grow up in cities or in suburbs, we're just really detached from where our products come from.
And this kind of research can help close that gap.
I hope so. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's the goal. And students get really excited about when you make these discoveries. Hopefully you can hear this from me too, how much fun this is. Students really enjoy learning, oh, there's a difference here, and I can actually potentially so I can potentially understand how I'm using, and they don't see themselves as having a lot of money, but how I can be intentional with my money. There's been a push recently, for instance, in coffee, to be able to empower both consumers and producers with technology. Technology sometimes is seen as getting in the way of things, but at least in coffee, one way that technology and potentially AI, but technology might empower those who are interested in coffee is allowing coffee consumers to understand exactly where their coffee came from. So not just Guatemala, but actually from a specific farm, maybe picked by a specific person. And then maybe these communities that historically have had lots of political and market obstacles to actually understanding how to market and sell their product at the highest, benefit, understanding, oh, this person in Bloomington, Indiana is going to be buying my coffee, and this is probably how they'll drink this. We from time to time in my classes we watch documentaries on coffee. There are a bunch of great documentaries, and my student, one of the tropes that we see over and over, a very common scene, is a producer on the ground, and in South America or Central America trying their coffee for the first time, like as an espresso. And they're like, oh, this tastes good. And my students are like, what is going on here? They've never tried their own coffee. But that seems like, depending on the product, not that uncommon
Mhm.
for largely poor people who produce our things around the world.
Well, Clark, thank you so much for taking the time to share this with me. It's been great.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me at Hagley. I would encourage anyone who hasn't had a chance to travel to Delaware, to visit the whole campus, or whatever you call the grounds are just beautiful. The buildings are beautiful. Everyone was so welcoming. So if you're a researcher and you're thinking about doing archival work, and there's a collection that makes sense to consult, I could not have had a better experience. And I look forward to continuing to share out what I've learned as I'm still processing some of my research, moving forward. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And thanks for saying so. And for our audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.